take a look at this. So you've read the chapters. You know something about what's unfolding here. The law of human nature is where he's starting, so we will start there too, chapter 1, and try to figure out. So what is this? What is the law of nature? So anybody remember what that is? Law of nature.
Dealing with what's good, right and wrong, what's good and bad. I think most people innately know that.
That's,
Even without the laws in the Bible,
yeah,
everyone knows.
it's kind of built in, and they know it exists. Yeah, laws of right and wrong that people already know, are familiar with, and they are fighting for them all the time. The law of nature. So if you've ever had kids in the back seat of your car and you're traveling, and they go, he's my space, he touched me, he's breathing, and that's not fair comes up. And then we carry that on into adulthood with pretty much everything that goes on. Well, that's not fair. How come that car cut me off on the freeway? How come that guy got promoted and I didn't? All the things, that's not fair. And there's no written rules for that. There's no written rules for the back seat, except that when they get loud enough, then there are rules. Y'all think that was bad? Come on out here. Anyway, so that's not fair is built in. So yeah, Mike, it's innate. It's part of who we are. And he is trying to give us a clue as to there's something more. There's something out there. There's something in us. There's something beyond us. And we need to explore what that could be. So he's going to dig into that and take us in that direction. And it's so built in that it is a response. When he gets to chapter 2, he starts, between chapter 1, he did chapter 1 as a radio broadcast. Then it's a week later, the BBC gets mail. So chapter 2 is actually a response to the people going, what are you thinking? So in answer to that, he begins to respond to why he was saying, it wasn't even planned. He stuck it in there and to answer them. And that chapter you pick up, even the Nazis understand something about this. And this is 1941. They haven't even gotten to finding the number of people in concentration camps. This is early in the war. They know the Nazis are bad enough. They don't know that part yet because they haven't discovered all that depth of depravity. But he knows that there's a sense in which the people who are being attacked are going, there's something wrong with this. So if you've read things about World War II or seen movies about World War II, you get a sense of what's going on. And of course, we're the victors and we're America, so the Nazis are always going to be the bad people. So we always keep them over there. But there's a sense of, okay, so that was deeply wrong. And where do we get that? Where does that wrong come from? We didn't have the international court. We had the League of Nations after World War I, but we didn't have a court that determined here are the laws that you must follow. You ought not, people just in their own heads going, you ought not treat people like that. So that's the law of nature built into people. And it reacts. Did anything in that chapter kind of grab you? He's saying it's all over the earth. It's everybody. You do have that, once in a while, small percentage of sociopaths, psychopaths who don't sense that. That would be the outliers. But the typical person is going to have some sense of fairness, and so the law of nature is dealing with the right and wrong. So anything stand out there to you from that?
One thing I thought about is that some people choose to ignore the right and wrong either because they just want this to be all rules because that's their nature, gives them pleasure or whatever. They want to do what they want to do, so they're bound by rules or whatever. Sociopath.
Yeah, sociopath. Yeah.
Person. And a lot of people, go ahead and do the right thing. First of all, avoid the punishment that would be inflicted. And a lot of times just because they know what's right, but they're bad themselves to do what's right.
Yeah. So it is a draw to have that. It motivates you if you're feeling it, if you're not a psychopath. If otherwise you're just going, I don't feel nothing. I just do what I want. Yeah. It does make us feel good to go, man, I'm keeping that. I'm in line with that. Law of nature. We do break it, and the ought to is something that seems to come through from what Lewis is talking about. The ought is the part, we don't perfectly keep this, so even though we know what's not fair, we know what better when it's not fair toward us. We don't know sometimes what's not fair when we're dealing with other people because we kind of just go on. We're more concerned about how we feel and how we've been dealt with. But he is trying to reach out, trying to show us that there's more to this. So the ought part of that is an aspect of this whole thing. Or I guess, it depends on if you're into buckshot. But the ought is the, I'm feeling it, and this is how you ought to treat somebody. And so that's when we come up with the fairness thing. You ought not do that. And so we have unwritten rules on how people ought to eat, you just start moving into the realm, how they ought to drive. You can drive through Tulsa. If you've been out in the country, you drive through Tulsa and go, they ought to drive better than that. And then you drive down to Dallas and you go, they really ought to drive better than that. And you just kind of go through. It's all of this. It's all built in. There's no big sign out there telling you this is how you're going to do it. Now, some traffic rules, but the ought tos are motivation at a different level. And he's headed a particular place with all of this. Do you remember what that is? Why this matters?
You can't answer the question of why Christianity. What Christianity answers unless you know the questions to ask.
So you got to find, this is a basis for finding why Christianity is credible. Yeah. So we're looking for answers to Christianity. And this points to, the law of nature points to that there is a divine person who is above and beyond, who is working this system, who has planted that in us, and that randomness in the universe does not produce a sense of law of nature, what's right and wrong, what's fair. Randomness just leads to additional chaos. It is unfeeling. It is disconnected from anything that would lead to ought tos. The ought is a reminder to us every day and to every person that there's something more. These things that exist that are far beyond, above what we typically work and do or think about in our day-to-day existence. So there are, I'm going to put this out there before you, there are other, this is philosophy in the Christian faith. this gives a breakdown from medieval thought, medieval philosophy, through pretty much 20th century. But just here are the contents. These are different arguments, different ways of thinking, different philosophies that have been presented. So you can see there's some, there's some more. And those are just since the medieval period and more. So these are people wrestling with the idea, is there a God? If there is a God, how do we know that there's a God? What evidence do we have that there is a God out there? And then the various ways of understanding, how do we approach morality? How do we approach who God is and who we are as human beings? If there's a God, then that affects who we are as human beings. And this is two approaches to truth. How do we get to truth? It puts all those pieces together. What he's done is narrowed in on the moral argument. So that is one of these. That's one argument out of all of those. And he says this one is so built in, and he's talking to the general public within the United Kingdom. So he's addressing the wide array of people who by 1941 have pulled away from traditional thinking, traditional Christian thinking, and even for us, you'd think, oh man, in the 40s they were still just really connected to God, and not so much. That's why he's addressing this, coming from this particular perspective, the law of nature. So we've got, let's see, his 2 points. This is on page 8 in this particular book, but he's trying to bring this thing down. Page 8, it says the point is that there are one more proof of how deeply, whether we like it or not, we believe in the law of nature. If we do not believe in decent behavior, why should we be so anxious to make excuses for not having behaved decently? The truth is, we believe in decency so much we feel the rule of law pressing on us, that we cannot bear to face the fact that we are breaking it. And consequently, we try to shift the responsibility. For you notice that it is only for our bad behavior that we find all these explanations. It is only our bad temper that we put down to being tired or worried or hungry. We put our good temper down to ourselves. We're just cute. So, 2 points I wanted to make. First, that human beings all over the earth have this curious idea that they ought to behave in a certain way and cannot really get rid of it. Secondly, that they do not, in fact, behave in that way. Bummer. They know the law of nature, they break it. These two facts are the foundation of all clear thinking about ourselves and the universe we live in. So he narrows it down. Okay, we're gonna deal with this law of nature. That's where we're gonna go with this, so that we can begin to understand who we are, how we function in the world, how the rest of the people on this planet function, how they think, what they value, and then we're gonna point this in the direction of that there is a God, and that he sent his son, and to make sense of all of that, which is not in the first 5 chapters, we're just laying the foundation. There's an ought to that's running around behind us that is keeping us going. In the chapter 2 with the objections, these are the letters that he got that responded to the first chapter that we have, the first radio broadcast. And his on page 9, isn't what you call the moral law simply our herd instinct? And hasn't it been developed just like our other instincts? So we just came up with this, or we were taught it, or it came along somewhere. And his thing, no. there is a herd instinct, and there are things that we developed, and he goes into that, like our connections to love, instincts for other motivations, drives that we have. But it's quite different from feeling that you ought to help, whether you want to or not. The instincts will just take you to where you want to go, because that's what you're feeling you want to do. But ought to goes far beyond it, because it wants to take us to help to provide assistance, to get somebody out of the cold, to feed them when they're hungry, and it pushes us beyond what we would typically do. Herd instinct would say, I'm going to protect myself. I'm going to make sure that nothing happens to me. But ought to says, I need to take care of that other person. That there's something important in the family, other people, people in the community, people in society, and I ought to be part of that. So that's one of his dealing with the objections. And it is it's pretty cool. Whoa, let's see this one. This one's good. How he explains that. You probably want to be safe much more than you want to help the man who is drowning. But the ought to part says you ought to help the guy who's drowning. So you overcome the instinct, the herd instinct, the natural instinct, and you go with the ought to, or you ought to overcome and go jump in the water and go help that guy. And that some of his illustrations are just great as you go through this thing. He touches on, this is over in 11. I don't know how your pages are tracking with this, but strictly speaking, there are no such things as good and bad impulses. There are impulses. Think once again of a piano. It has two kinds of notes on it, the right notes and the wrong notes. Okay. Every single note is right at one time, wrong at another. Isn't that just awesome? The moral law is not any one instinct or set of instincts. It is something which makes a kind of tune, the tune we call goodness or right conduct, by directing the instincts. You think about the guys who come back. This is World War II. They've already had World War I, and they had to absorb those guys into society. And then we're down the road a piece. So we've had World War II in Korea and Vietnam and the Gulf War or wars. And you go, okay, so those guys, they are 18, 19, 20 years old. They're given a weapon. They're told to go out there and kill people. Is that a good thing to just go out there and kill people? Well, you ought not kill people. But there's a time. So is it always bad? No. It's really good if you're protecting your home, if you're protecting you put all of that in. It's a different note that ought to be played at a particular time. So they get back and they're wired, and then you have to kind of talk them down and process them, get them through, get them on the other side. One of my jobs at Oklahoma State, when I was working for the Veterans Administration, Veteran Affairs there, I had counseling. But my job was to help these guys who are coming in change from military thinking to being in college. And they are Vietnam. I'm that old. These guys are coming back from some shift somewhere from Vietnam. And so we'd go I had 2 offices on campus. They didn't really like sitting in an office. So we'd just go get coffee somewhere and we'd get talking. And then we'd start dealing with those things. And we're dealing with, how do you unwire yourself? Because you ought not run around. Don't kill the professor, that guy that ticks you off in class. You ought not. You ought not punch that guy. And, well, we're in the cafeteria on it. This is a different scenario, but this particular guy had a short temper, and multiple black belts and things, martial artist-ish. And some guy ticked him off. He went off on him. You go, oh, okay, well, that guy's bleeding all over the place. And then this guy is mad, but he's also embarrassed because he just responded so quick. So he takes off. I go after him. Dude, you ought not do that. You ought not be busting up on people. What is going on? And he had actually felt it inside too, that was a wrong response. But the training is such, and the same thing for these military guys, the training is such that their immediate response is, that's what you do in this situation. Wrong key, wrong tune, wrong place, wrong time. Is there a right place for it? Absolutely. In fact, if you don't do it in those situations, you ought to do it in those situations. So this whole moral thing, law, and how it works for us, there's a bigger picture, and that whole piano key thing is really good. There are right notes and wrong notes. And every single note is right at one time, wrong at another. And we need to know that too, how that works. But he's answering questions. Those are questions that people wrote in to the BBC going, what are you saying, buddy? So, page 13, progress means not just changing, but changing for the better. If no set of moral ideas were truer or better than any other, there would be no sense in preferring civilized morality to savage morality or Christian morality to Nazi morality. Yeah, well, we know there's a big difference there. So he deals with a number of those. The reality of the law, that's back in 3. And if you're reading the first part of chapter 3, you can tell that the chapter 2 was inserted. I don't know if that helps you with the flow of this thing, but you can tell. He says, now I go back to what I said at the end of the first chapter. So he's giving you a clue. That other thing I just had to deal with because, a lot of questions in between. And listen, two odd things about the human race. First, that they were haunted by the idea of a sort of behavior they ought to practice, what you might call fair play or decency or morality or the law of nature. Second, they didn't do it. Yeah. And you wonder, what in the world? What's wrong with us? How would we know that we didn't do it? Why is it that in humans there's built in this thing of guilt and shame? And you go, I ought to have followed through. Even people who have no Christian training at all. This is just worldwide. Ought to have done whatever. Ought not to have done something else. And then they sense it. They sense it in themselves. And they don't even have to be told. It's just there. Now the training on ought to's in a civilized pattern, we need training. We need, how the silverware lays out, when to eat what, those kind of there's steps to things in just life that we need to learn. But this other, the ought to's, that's a built-in kind of thing. And he is telling us that there is more to this. It's, and it's not the law, in this chapter is the one where he deals with, it's not the law like the law of nature that is gravity. So the rock has no choice. It doesn't feel like I ought to fall. It just falls. So we don't behave that way when we're treating the world around us, the people around us. We ought to do certain things. We sense that. We're not like a law, law of gravity that you just do it. Wouldn't it be nice if we just did that? You ought to love each other. We just do that. No, we don't. So that's the problem. It's not just built in to follow through on that all the time. We ought to.
Gravity, it's there whether you believe it or not.
Yeah.
This law, you have a choice.
You have a choice. You can do it. Yeah. It's still there whether we believe it or not. but we can choose to do it or not. Yeah. The rock has no choice. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. Rock is stuck. Well, so are we if we jump out of an airplane. Same thing. Yep, he kind of hits out on 20, just like Mike's saying. The moral law or the law of human nature is not simply a fact about human behavior in the same way as the law of gravitation is, or maybe simply a fact about how heavy objects behave, on the other hand, is not mere fancy, for we cannot get rid of the idea. And most of the things we say and think about, men would be reduced to nonsense if we did. It's not simply a statement about how we should behave towards others for our own convenience, for the behavior we call bad or unfair is not exactly the same as the behavior we find inconvenient. And we may find it the opposite. Consequently, this rule of right and wrong, or the law of human nature, must somehow or other be a real thing, a thing that is really there, not made up by ourselves, which is his point in chapter 3. We didn't make it up. It's there. We all have it. It's worldwide, and it affects us in our interactions with others and what we conceive about the world we live in and who God is, because he's moving in that direction. So we get a little tidbit of that along the way. Did anything in chapter 3 grab you? No grabbing. Okay. There's a more intentional movement towards there's more to this, than more to the ought to, more to what's built into human beings, and he begins to pick that up in chapter 4 with what lies behind the law. So down for page 21, the law of human nature, or right and wrong, must be something above and beyond the actual facts of human behavior. In this case, besides the actual facts, you have something else, a real law which we did not invent and which we know we ought to obey. You go, how is this possible? It's universal. It's really there. We all sense it. We know there's an ought to. And little kids pick up that's not fair as soon as they can make words. And you go, in any language. I don't know what the other languages say for fair, but there you go. They know it. And you go, okay, we didn't teach them that. They didn't watch that on Sesame Street. Where'd they get this? And it just is there. And then you turn them loose and PK, and you watch and see what they do in there with their buddies. That's not fair. He took my block. And they go at it. So we have this real thing that exists. It's universal. It's working in all of us, and it's pointing us to something beyond just the material, random existence of life on this planet. Part of what Lewis has to deal with is the materialist perspective. By this time, mid-century, mid-20th century, people have really embraced, and this is in the educational system, books, movies, things that are just out there. What they're consuming is materialism. It continues, it's still here today, and it limits everything. And so he has to take them to a place, take them beyond their normal thinking. Yay, I get to write something. They have to get beyond certain, I'm going to put it down here. So what has taken place the existence of everything gets narrowed down to what are the formulas for it, what's the math on this, what's the science, and it's science from a particular bent. It's not just, good science wouldn't leave you here, but just limited science would. Limited science has a box. So length, height, it's got the dimensions, 3D. You can add some quantum physics. You can add some cool stuff to it, but it's still limited. That's as far as it's going to go. And because of some things that happened in the approach to science in the late 1800s, it leads into the thinking and left some people really depressed. They started screaming and reaching out, trying to find some reason for human beings to be here. This became reality, and when they bought that reality, they go, this just is awful. And if you look at the art that changes from realism, reflecting life, that has things like artists came up with ways to reflect, to take a oil painting and have it glow with the light being reflected off something, refracted through something. Rembrandt was brilliant at being able to do that. He can have a group of people in a dark place, and you can see them lighted up slightly as they're coming out of the dark, and then all of a sudden this central figure is just brilliantly lit. And you go, how can you do some paint and make it do that? And they also mix their own paint. That's part, and we don't know the formula, but he was able to do that, and it would just bring it out. The Dutch painters did the same thing. So you look at like a painting, a painting of still life stuff of fruit in a jug by a window. And you go, so what? For us, it's no big deal. Back then, they were changing from really 2D flat art to this, so it was amazing. But the light just is brilliant. It's coming out of there. It's alive. You get to the end of the 1800s, 1900s. Do you remember the pictures? Anybody go through a blue period? Anybody start drawing women like, there you go. There's Sophia. Why? What happened? What was affecting that period of time so greatly that across the board, there's this whole artistic shift from doing this amazing thing. I'm looking at beauty. I'm looking at what God created to, there she is, my beautiful bride. Dude, you may want to check your glasses. But they were stuck here. This is it. Well, is there anything beyond that? Is there true beauty? Is there such a thing as soul? Is there, no, you're just alive or dead. You die, you go in the graveyard, done. There is nothing beyond this box, materialism. The science, the math, so we got it figured out. We know how far the sun is. We know about electricity. We can call each other on a phone. The telegraph was fun, but we can do this. We're traveling faster than 12 miles an hour, which they thought would blow you up on a train. So now we know. We've got the answers to all things. And materialism took off. Then depression hit. Then, if you've heard of existential philosophy, began in that period because people are going, I need to know that I exist, that I have a reason. And they start truly screaming. So this is a scream. The philosophy comes out as a scream. And I'm telling you all that because what Lewis is trying to answer is, here's a whole world of people who need something more than this. And guess what? It's already built in us. The clue is in us. And we can know it. He can take us to deal with this later, but we need to figure out what is it in us. So what's up here? God, truth, let's put values, love, beauty. It's up above the line. Those things exist in the soul, the mind. It exists here, and it's going to flow from God. He's not there yet. That's not chapter 4. But what he's trying to counter is this. There's a material reality, and it has overwhelmed. And you can read science books, you can take a science class, and when you're done with that class, just evaluate it. It will be here, because they don't touch this anymore. Now, there are certain schools that do, but not everybody does. So the majority of the stuff that's just out there, go to YouTube, pull up something, figure out, okay, well, how's that work? They're going to land here, which is just what Lewis was finding in the world in 1941. So you read too many of these, that's all the stuff that starts coming out. Just saying. Just might be.
That's why there's so much chaos today.
That's why there's chaos. Exactly. It adds to it. And the more we put him back in his rightful place, which is what Lewis is trying to do and lead us to, it changes how we deal with, how we see ourselves, how we deal with the people around us, how we deal with the world. If we can do that across the board, we've got a whole new thing unfolding, whole new way of living, whole new way of seeing life. And we ought to. We ought to do it. We'll pursue him. This one was so cool. This is just a statement. It's not the big answer to anything. I just like how he said it. We do not merely observe people. We are people. In this case, we have, so to speak, inside information. We are in the know. So it's not just observing all of the stuff out there, the ought tos. It's in us. We are people. We are in the know. We can know this. We don't have to go check out the book at the library or it's us. It's in us. And we know we ought to do certain things, and we know that we ought not to have done other things. And then all that catches up with us, and you go, why? Well, I was taught, that's how I was raised. Some of this isn't how you were raised. And you don't start out as a little kid going, that ain't fair. How do you know that from the get-go? So, it's built in. Anyone studying people from the outside as we study electricity or cabbages, not knowing our language and consequently not able to get any inside knowledge from us, merely observing what we did, would never get the slightest evidence that we had this moral law. They ought to, because all they're watching is how we treat each other, how we live. And he's going, obviously, you don't have much of a moral law the way you're acting. I think the law changed this last week in Oklahoma to, if you don't move over for an emergency vehicle, it went from a fine of $250 to like $1,500. If you have a second one, it's $2,500. Because we ought to give them space. But since we don't, oh boy, it's going to get pricey. Continuing in chapter 4, I don't get to open all these things that the mailman delivers. I'm only allowed to open the one that's addressed to me or me. When I do, this is page 25, when I do, especially when I open that particular man called myself, I find that I do not exist on my own, that I am under a law, that somebody or something wants me to behave in a certain way. There's a power behind the facts, a director, a guide. Ooh, cool. So he's getting closer. You see how he's moving from just the general stuff out there, and he starts moving this thing more and more. As I'm looking at myself, I'm seeing that there's something here above the line. And chapter 5, we have cause to be uneasy. Lewis, what are you saying? I ended my last chapter with the idea that in the moral law, somebody or something from beyond the material universe was actually getting at us. Yeah. I expect when I reached that point, some of you felt a certain annoyance. Yeah. You may have even thought I had played a trick on you, that I had been carefully wrapping up to look like philosophy what turns out to be one more religious jaw. I really don't understand the jaw word here, but maybe it's just, anyway. He's trying to avoid looking too churchy in this thing. So,
Well, because don't you think he's not trying to promote the religion, but the faith?
yeah.
Yeah, and
He's
so
trying to avoid
that's
all
why
the
he's like-
denominations and
Yes.
all the spin, yeah. And he doesn't want people's minds to take off on that first thing.
Yes.
Yeah, and if you say, oh, you're Lutheran, or you're, and then, and you go, oh, gee, how are you gonna reel them back in? So, yeah, he's trying to avoid it. He's done pretty good of being able to piece that together. We've only got so far as a somebody or something behind the moral law. We're not taking anything from the Bible or the churches. We are trying to see what we can find out about this somebody on our own steam. And I want to make it quite clear that what we find out on our own steam is something that gives us a shock. We have two bits of evidence about the somebody. One is the universe he has made. If we use that as our only clue, then I think we should have to conclude that he was a great artist, for the universe is very beautiful, but also that he is quite merciless and no friend to man, for the universe is a very dangerous and terrifying place. The other bit of evidence is that moral law, which he has put into our minds. Yeah, okay, and this is a bit better than the other because it's inside information. You find out more about God from the moral law than from the universe in general, just as you find out one or more about a man by listening to his conversation than by looking at a house he's built. He just does so good on these things, his reasoning, his tying this thing together. He just says, I want to have people look at the facts, look at inside, see what drives us, why we do what we do, why we go the direction we go, and to understand that we are not stuck in a material-only universe. We are in a material universe, not material only. So he hasn't done this yet. He's just saying there's somebody, there's something more than this. How does that strike you? This idea.
Very good.
Does it help to say, oh, yeah, I've seen that. I've noticed that in me. Notice the...
Not me.
It's those other people. Yeah. You ought to, you ought not.
Well, the ought to has been playing in my brain since the summer. I've even used it at other people, the ought to and the ought not. So it's interesting that that's the verbiage, because it's true. It's in us.
That's where he starts.
That's where it starts.
Yeah. And we can check it out because it's in us. You just carry it around with us. Yeah, we can argue about this, and what we know about science, we can put some pieces together. We see the material world. But when it gets in here, and you go, yeah, there's more to it. I could be better. And I ought to be better. So, yeah, takes us in a different direction. That, let me give you a chapter. I think chapters 1 and 2, if you would, for next time, of the next book. What Christians Believe. Book 2, chapters 1 and 2. So he's going to get to it, by golly. Yes?
Can I say something that's goes back to another thing you said about jaw?
Yeah, good, 'cause
The only reason I really understood that is that my grandfather, my grandfather Worthington, who you knew,
Oh, yeah.
Randy, I don't know if you know, he's first generation American and his father was English. And my grandfather used to talk about, well, let's jaw about that.
Huh.
And it meant talk about it.
It's John. Yeah,
Yeah.
we were John in the back.
It's John.
Yeah, yeah.
That's how he always said it, and I don't know, it might have been of that era, that it was a kind of a
Would have
thing
been
where it
that
might be
time for him,
English
yeah.
too, yeah.
Yeah, religious jaw, so religious talk,
Yeah.
religious conversation, yeah, that makes sense.
But it's also, if you're jawing,
It was-
sometimes it's too much.
It's
Your
too
jaw's
much, yeah.
just going.
And,
You're
and it's,
jawing.
and it's inconsequential,
Yes.
or, you know, it's just like oh, we were just jawing.
Yeah.
You know, it's just like, oh, it was just a lowly conversation of some sort, you know, or, yeah.
That would fit
Ring
with
me,
where
you
he's
got that
going
right.
too,
Mhm.
yeah,
We-
sees it
we-
as, yeah, you're just throwing that religious
Yeah,
stuff
just,
at me
yeah,
and, come
jawing
on,
about it,
yeah, going on and on,
on and on, yeah.
yeah, that makes
That's the
sense.
way I read it,
That's the
and
way
in
I
my
read it, too.
mind, I replaced it with yapping.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
That would work.
okay.
Yeah,
That's how Arkansans use it.
Mhm.
We're jawing.
Oh,
Jawing.
really?
See,
Yeah.
okay, my
We're just
country folk
yapping,
use
like,
jawing all the time,
you
yeah.
know.
huh,
No, that's funny. Anyway,
Talk at
Just an
length or to
expression.
chatter.
Yes. it is an expression.
talk
Like
at
in
length and
Arkansas,
to
they
chatter,
Throw trash, they
But I
push
think
it.
of jaws
Going on and on.
so he doesn't, yeah, I'm not doing that. Just so you know, we're not going that direction. Well, in these next chapters, he will turn the page and we will be into some Christian, looking at how Christianity works, and he's not doing religious jaw, by golly. So that'll be good. Let's pray. Father, thanks for this time. Thanks for allowing us to dig into these things. And even though it's nearly 100 years, you know, we can learn from Lewis and the things that he had to face. And these truths continue no matter what. So guide us as we read and think and discuss and show us how we ought to live. In Jesus' name, amen.